Out of Deuteronomy today, what I want to do is I want to give you a brief overview of the setting of Deuteronomy. Then I want you to look at one specific period of time in its context, related to what I talked about last week. And this is the time that the children of Israel have been to the Jordan the first time and failed to cross over. Deuteronomy begins, Moses and the Israelites begin the Exodus about 1440 BC. And this book is probably written around 1400 BC. It is right at the 40th year of their time, and they're moving into the Promised Land. Moses is now 120 years old. He is going to pass away very shortly. He will not lead the people into the Promised Land. He will pass the baton on to Joshua. This generation largely was born in the wilderness journey. When the children of Israel came to the Jordan the first time, after God had delivered them out of Egypt, God had given them the land, they chose not to go into the land. Moses will address that here in the first chapter. When they refused to go into the land, God said, in this wilderness, all of you who are over 20 years of old will perish. So there would have been in the congregation on this day, because Deuteronomy is about Moses delivering a set of messages. On this one, that is the beginning, there would have been people who would have been in 60 at that period of time, all the way down to young children, because he has called all of the people together. Everyone else that was a part of that initial generation that came to the edge of the Promised Land that was over 20 years old, they have either perished by now or they will shortly. But none of them will enter into the Promised Land. That's the setting that's here. So God has brought these people. They have wandered for almost 40 years. He has provided for them. Their clothes haven't worn out. Their shoes haven't worn out. He has rained down manna from heaven. All of that will be recounted here in chapter 1. There is the pillar of fire and the cloud in which he has led them and guided them and warmed them when they were cold. So God has taken care of them in the wilderness, but it was a wandering because their destiny was death, because they rejected the promise of God. One day in which they were faced with walking into the land that is written in the record that God was giving them, not that they picked, that God was giving them, but they got their eyes on something that caused them to not walk in. One day kept them from their destiny. The reason I address this today is because I wonder, in all of our lives, beyond the days of crisis, the days of circumstance, the days of accomplishment, those things that are noteworthy that we can remember and mark that have affected our lives, what about other days? Are there other days where we did not walk into what God had for us? And what has been the ramification of that? And maybe our assessment of that is, well, I've survived. Look at this. God is, God's been good to me and this and that. But that's not the question. God took care of these people in the wilderness. But they missed his purpose. And they missed his plan. And so when you come to the end of chapter 1, verse 46, there's a very interesting verse. This 46th verse will say, "So you remained in Kadesh many days, according to the days that you spent there." The New Living Translation says, "So you stayed there at Kadesh for a long time." So you stayed there for a long time. Where they are was simply to be the place that they passed by in moving into the promise. The promise was their place. The promise was their future. The promise was permanence. The promise was a land. It wasn't just a geographic location in the land. People who had been slaves would now be landowners. So there would be significance. They would find out who they were. There would be the blessing of the Lord. God wouldn't necessarily directly take care of them as he did with manna. In the land, the intent of God was for them to be productive. So rulership was restored to them. All of those things were forfeited because they didn't go into the land. I want to ask you to take a look at this first chapter, starting in verse 19. And I was going to read all of this. You need to. But for the sake of time, I want to just point out a few verses. But it's important for you to go back and read this. This address, remember that Moses is giving at least largely to the surviving generation. Most everything that is referred to here is what the previous generation went through and why they died and didn't make it. And Moses is going now to their children and probably some of their grandchildren, to all who hadn't died in the wilderness, but now this new generation, and he's saying, here's what happened. You need to know. You need to know because you are right back at the same place. You're not just at the same place where you're going to go across the Jordan, but the same circumstances, the same issues that caused your forefathers to not go in still exist. The giants are still there. The walled cities. You look like grasshoppers. That was what your forefathers said. They're larger. We're not able. We're not strong enough. They're far more mighty than we are. You got your eyes on your forefathers got their eyes on the wrong things. What will you put your eyes on? And so this address in chapter 1 is Moses saying, you need to know what happened yesterday, so yesterday won't become your tomorrow. And so when you read through here, he goes back through Israel's refusal to enter the land. So he says, verse 21, look, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and possess it as the Lord God of your fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear or be discouraged. That will be the exact same instructions that are given to this generation. Exactly. Just open the book of Joshua and read the opening of the book of Joshua. Moses here will talk about the spies that were sent out into the land, and the report that they came back with. It's a good land, which the Lord Our God is giving us. Verse 25, notice that. The Lord our God is giving us. Somewhere they lost sight of that when they saw the giants. Verse 26, nevertheless you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You know, we are so used to, in America, we're so used to consumerism, options, choices. That's great. Have it your way, pick it your way, have it all that, except when it comes to God. Consumerism stops where God begins. And here's the thing, folks. You could say, well, Steve, I'm going to go to another church that'll just you know, do things for me. Well, you're free to do that. You do have that option. But what you don't have the option of is coming before the Lord and saying, give me my options. He doesn't have any. He just has his way. As a matter of fact, remember I did a whole series on God said, my way isn't your way. It's not just that God has no options, it's that he's already told you up front, he is not taking you the way you want to go. If you're going to go with him, you got to go his way. There is no other way. Just his way. I could have helped God out if he'd come and asked me. I pastored a long time. I could tell him, God, you're going to get a whole lot more success with people if you approach this differently. He didn't seem to care about that a bit. My ways, he does define his way. My ways are higher than your way. They're not just different. My ways are higher. I want to tell you, I can speak for Becky and me as someone who for over half a century have done our best to walk the way of the Lord. His highways, oh, they are always the best ways. He takes you places you never, ever dreamed possible. He puts things into your hand you would have never imagined. In fact, when you've walked with the Lord this long and you look back, you just stand there in wonder and amazement and go, what in the world? How did all of this take place? It's because God, as he spoke through Jeremiah, he has a future and hope for you. He has thought some things about you. You aren't just a number or a statistic or just one of the people in a great big crowd of people. No, he knows you. And if no one else thinks highly of you, God does. In fact, he thought so highly of you, he marked you with his own son. Because it's the only way you could become his child, if you came that way. And so what a tragedy if you live your life in a way where God takes care of you, but you've wandered in a wilderness rather than lived in relationship with the living God where he has led you in places you would never go or could go on your own. So you go through here and they talk about what they see, the walled cities. They send 12 spies, they come back. 2 of the spies said they bring back this fruit of the land, the produce, and it's absolutely amazing. They say it is exactly what God said. This land does flow with milk and honey. It's so great, and we're well able. We need to go up and take this. And 10 of them say, yeah, it's exactly right. That's the fruit of the land. The land is flowing with milk and honey. It's everything God said it was. But there's something you need to know. You think you're going to go over there and just have a party? There's giants over there. There are cities with walls so thick we've never seen anything like that before. I can tell you right now, the spies said, I can tell you right now, we've seen this with our own eyes and we are not able. And right there, every single person in Israel was faced with a choice. Would they obey God or would they listen to what man said? And I can just, this is very, very deep. You should get this. Whenever you decide that man knows better than God, you have a problem. A big problem. The Israelites experienced the hand of God at work in miracles from the time they left Egypt until the time they reached Kadesh Barnea here. They had seen enough miracles along the way that they should have been able to trust God for anything. Why did that generation that Moses is telling the second generation about? Here's what the scripture says. Verse 43, I spoke to you, you would not listen, but rebelled against the command of the Lord. And that was after they decided not to go. And then God said, okay, turn aside. See that wilderness? You're going to die there. Oh no, we'll go. Oh, God, you can count. Oh, no. They just decided they're going to go anyway. God said, no, don't go. You try to go. You're going to die. Because evidently, the plan of God, the way of God, has a time. A time. And you don't get to, God is not waiting till you're ready. He has already decided when you're ready. And that's why he told you to go, when he told you to go. So what happened? Well, let me give you just a couple of reasons, I think. One, their circumstances caused them to make the wrong decision. Circumstances. We've already talked about those. Walled cities and giants. And they gave God's people a grasshopper complex. The people of God said, we look like grasshoppers in their sight. They looked at the challenge that was before them and they felt small and insignificant and powerless. No ability. They couldn't see with these eyes how what was set before them could be accomplished. Because they looked at God in light of their circumstances rather than looking back at the God who had performed miracles for them. If God could open the Red Sea, those giants are no big deal. If he could drown all of the armies of Pharaoh by bringing those waters back together, is no big deal for God. Secondly, they made the mistake of trying to handle what they thought would be coming in the future, but they weren't there yet. They were not there yet. They weren't at Jericho yet. They weren't out the mountain where the giants lived. They weren't there yet. They are still at the place of beginning. And what God is asking them to do is not to fight the battle of Jericho, because they're not at Jericho yet. He's not asking them to defeat the giants. They're not at the giants yet, but he is asking them to put their foot into the Jordan. And because of what they saw down the road and perceived as impossible, they didn't do what they could do today by putting their foot into the water. The children of Israel were more influenced by the size of men than they were by the size of their God. And then the negative influence of 10 spies. The negative influence of 10 kept the people of God from having God's best for them. 10. 10. 10 men who said, look, we saw it. These are the facts. You need to know. 10 men caused a people who had experienced the miraculous departure as slaves from Egypt to want to return and think that their slavery in Egypt, they were far better off than they were under the hand of a miracle-working, supernatural God. How do you get there? Whenever what's in front of you, the challenge of what's in front of you becomes larger than the God that you serve, it's amazing what you will grow comfortable with and live in. Let me wrap all of this up. I'm going to just move on to the end here. Let me just say that moving on with God always requires a step of obedience. What is yours as we walk into 2024? What is the day where the Lord is saying, you need to take this step? And what is it? Maybe for some of you, it's a step into baptism. You've put it off for so long. It's stuff that you don't intend to get around to it. You just never have. You didn't think it was that important or whatever. Because if you did, you'd have done it. And yet the Lord commanded it. Let me ask you, what do you miss out on when you don't take those steps of obedience to walk the way of the Lord? Let me answer that question. You don't know. You don't know. God never skips over your step of obedience and lets you move into things beyond it. Oh, I'll come back to that. No. Oh, no. You can't move into God's tomorrow. You might try to move into yours. You can't move into God's tomorrow till you take this first step. If you won't put your foot in the Jordan, you don't get to Jericho. If you don't put your foot in the Jordan, the only grapes you got to see are the ones they carried back. You never get to Eshcol to see them. Steve, I'll just chart my own journey. Well, you can do that. I told one of our congregation members one time, he's a good guy. He just kept getting in his own way. He really loved God, but he was his own worst enemy. I said, you know, your problem is you always have to have it your way. And you're proud of that. And that's worked for everybody in your life. Well, sort of worked. Sort of worked. Because for a while, he had the world by the tail. More money than he could spend. Fame. People knew who he was. All of these kind of things. But pretty soon he lost his family. Then he lost his business. He always knew better. Good guy. I liked him. And he liked me. Today he'd cut his right arm off for me if I asked him to. How tragic. To have all this potential. But you got to have it your way. God says, look, see that wilderness? You can wander in that wilderness. I'll bring you back here to Kadesh from time to time to see if now you're willing to put your foot in the Jordan. But you're not going anywhere else. You don't get to hop in. You don't get to tell me to get rid of the giants. You don't get to tell me to take the walls of Jericho down and do all this, get everything ready. Lord, you get it all ready and I'll just move into it. You know me, Lord. And God says, that's the problem. I do know you. And what I'm doing with the journey is I'm shaping you into the person I want you to be so you can handle the victory that I'm giving you. See? Maybe it's time for you to learn how to pray in the power of the Spirit. Whatever else you do on Wednesday night, maybe it's time for you to say it's time to make that a priority, to come here, slug it out. As we intercede for the day, maybe you should quit talking about how the nation's going to hell in a handbasket if you're not willing to come here and pray the mind and will of God over this land, because however much we need to be engaged in the day, and we do, you know I believe in that. The battle for this nation will not be won with just our efforts. The battle for this nation will only be won if there is an intervention of God in this land. If he blows the breath of his Spirit one more time. If he moves some things that we cannot move. So if you're serious about that, you should be here for the sake of your children. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. If you feel guilty, don't come. I mean, if you only come because of that, you only come 1 week anyway. But for some of you, it's time to set aside whatever else you do on Wednesday night and say, I'm going to set my face to seek the Lord. The reason I'm going to do that is because God said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, and turn away from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven. And because if you understand something of the word, you understand that the early church, the most common phrase attributed to the early church, the book of Acts, was, and when they had prayed, and when they had prayed, and when they had prayed, and when they had prayed. I can't do anything about any other congregation. Tell you the truth. This is my assignment here. But I'll tell you what, if the churches across this nation were gathering and they were filled to capacity at the prayer meeting instead of trying to entertain all the folks on Sunday morning, you'd be living in a very different land today, I'm going to tell you. And look. Don't demean all the other churches and preachers if you're not coming to prayer meeting. I'm trying to figure out how to end this on a really high note where you're all cheering. I just have to keep preaching until I figure that out. Maybe you need to grow in the Word, so you're not tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. So you're an oak of righteousness, strong and stable in the evil day. Maybe God's calling you out of where you are to lead his people pastorally. You know, we want to plant churches out of this church all over the place. We don't have enough money to plant every church everywhere. We have enough money to plant some. We need people that God calls. You hear the call of God, not my call. The call of God. Maybe God's calling you to take some step of faith that you've been resisting. Maybe God's calling you to tithe. And if you're not, he is. Let me ask you this. Where have you seen and heard of God at work, but you don't trust him to work for you? You know, Malachi 3 opens, the passage on tithing is a very strong start. I would start there if I were God. Will a man rob God? That's the first phrase. What did you mean, God? Well, we have robbed me. Tithes and offerings. First tithe. Oh, just about money. No. About the first tenth. First. What's in first place? What's most important to you? Because see, God gave his tenth, his son. He gave the first. I wonder, if you're not a tither, I wonder how much you've missed of the blessing of God. Because Malachi 3 is where he says, I'll open the windows of heaven, pour out blessing on you. Oh, Steve, I couldn't afford to tithe. I get it. Becky and I were there. We know that. We know, and Becky probably more than me, the fear of sitting down to write out the bills. We couldn't, and how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? But we had a mandate in our heart from the Lord that it was time for us to stop justifying our disobedience and to walk his way. And look, you could believe this or not believe this. It's really just up to you. But if you asked me and you said, hey, Steve, do you think all the things that you and Becky have done, walked through, that God's let you do, things you have had, the blessing of the Lord, do you think you'd have all that? If you hadn't gotten it right back in that little apartment when your car was sitting on jacks because you couldn't afford to get it fixed, and you owed the finance company at 30% interest, and the furniture you're sitting on was mortgaged to the hilt, you'd gotten in credit card debt and you didn't know how to get out, and you just kept telling God if you made a little more money you'd be fine. Remember that? See, the visitation the Lord came to me at on that day wasn't as glamorous and glorious as some of the others I've had, but on that office, that little office, that one morning where I heard the voice of the Lord so clearly say, I want you to tithe. And I said, I can't. And God knew it was true. I can't. God said, I want you to tithe. The step, one day. If you ask me, I'm an old guy now. I don't need anything else to ever happen in my life. I've seen way more than I ever thought possible. So I'm not up here trying to sell you all anything. I just want to tell you, if you ask me, I'm going to tell you that the stuff the Lord has allowed Becky and I to walk through and experience is because of one day in an inconspicuous place when we got one thing right. And God opened the windows of heaven. I'm not talking just about money. I'm talking about things that are way bigger than money. See, one day Becky and I got a hold of something and we never looked back. And I guess I'm here just to tell you, it's not just true for us, it's true for you. All of you. Paul writes to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 9. The words are unbelievable. Both Malachi and 2 Corinthians, they are inspired, written by the Spirit of God, given to men to pen onto a page. And they come from a promise maker. Promise maker. But a promise maker also requires a promise keeper. In other words, if someone makes you a promise, maybe the first thing you ought to consider is, can they keep it? And but it requires something else. If a promise maker makes you a promise, and that's what God did to these people. In fact, the land was called the Promised Land. Interesting, isn't it? What was before them was promise. If you have a promise maker, and the promise maker is capable of keeping the promise, so you now have a promise maker and a promise keeper, that is not enough. It still requires you to believe that the promise maker, who is also the promise keeper, is capable for you. Because this promise maker, God himself, who is also the promise keeper, in his promise for you, will require something of you to receive the promise. It will be a step on a day. And if you take that step, it opens the door to everything of his purpose. But if you don't, the scripture says God has no pleasure in those who draw back. There is a wilderness there waiting for you of existence. God will take care of you there. But what he had for you over there, you'll never see that. As we enter 2024, may God help us, all of us. For the first thing the Lord to do is to speak to our own hearts. How willing are you to lay all of you out before you and say, Lord, see if there be any wicked way in me. See if there be anything in me that's other than your way. This is what this time is about. Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow I will do wonders among you. George Bernard Shaw, and I finish with this, said, the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man attempts to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. May you, as the people of God, live above reason, above the reason of man, the limitations of the reason of man when it comes to the purpose of God. May our hearts be so in tune with where he is and his promise to us, knowing that he is not only the promise maker, he is the promise keeper, and I can completely trust him that with great joy and abandonment, I will step beyond my reason into the realm of his reality, that his kingdom might come and his will might be done on earth as it is in heaven. Lord, I pray today for the people of Grace. I pray, God, in these weeks of preparation for 2024, that you will, through every one of our team who brings one of the teachings, that you will shape us into your people, the people of God. I pray that something dramatic will happen. That what will become common in the house will be people who not just being radical for that sake, but people who are finally coming to the place to step into faith, into what you have for them. I ask, Lord, for you to speak in these weeks. Through the time of fasting, I ask you to speak. As people come to afflict their soul, would you not only speak to us, but Lord, would you set the captive free? Would you break every kind of bondage? Would you do the things that we understand in your word that discipline releases? Would you birth another moment of renewal? Would you put in this house a deeper sense of what you're up to? Would you help us never get complacent with where you've brought us? We rejoice, Lord, at all you've done, all you're continuing to do. We rejoice at the testimonies of the outpouring of your grace. We stand here in the beginning of a year to say, Lord, what you've done yesterday, would you do it again? the dreams and hopes, plans and purpose that you have for us. Would you help us to walk that out, that we might represent you well? And would you come in your glory in this time and rest upon us? Would you use this house, these people, in the middle of this very dark, desperate hour to be a beacon of light and hope? Help us, Lord, to be a people that you couldn't tell our story and it be about us. But everything of our story is what you're working in us and through us. Do your work, O Lord. And let the remaining weeks and months of this year be a massive harvest of hungry people coming to find you. I pray this prayer in your name, the strong name of Jesus. Amen.